And welcome back to yet another edition of the I Prefer the 80s and 90s Sports podcast where I talk about why I prefer the sports of the 80s and 90s to the sports of today. Today's topic, well, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson and maybe you can figure it out and help me figure out what I'm trying to say. What I preferred about the 80s and 90s is that even though my team didn't win the Super Bowl, World Series, NHL, NBA Finals, the champions got the spoils. The champions were the teams that were talked about. Now, granted, in the 80s and 90s, they did not have as many shows and many outlets to talk about specific sports year-round as they do today. And that absolutely drives me crazy. Because there's always an anticipation for a new season in every sport. But not today. The anticipation, in my view, completely gone. And the funny thing is that the 80s and 90s were eras of sports of dynasties, of teams, specific teams that dominated their sport. And it even was that way in the 60s and the 70s. Like the champions were the champions, and you only talked about the champions because the only thing that mattered was winning. But today, it's social media, it's everybody's business is everybody's business. And to the victor doesn't go to spoils. Yes, we are being inundated this football season with Travis Kelce commercials. His team won the Super Bowl. And Patrick Mahomes, of course, is in every commercial as well. But that's very, very, very rare. Because when the Rams won the Super Bowl, I didn't see any commercials from Matthew Stafford. Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp was the MVP of the Super Bowl. See any commercials featuring him. When the Giants beat the Patriots the second time, I didn't see any commercials about Eli Manning. Now, maybe in New York there were commercials, but I'm talking nationally watched commercials. I mean, Eli and Peyton did the pork and beans commercial, or Eli got the hot sauce commercial. That was it, one commercial, hot sauce. But usually, today is about the star athletes that aren't winning championships or didn't win a championship that year. Maybe they held that commercial from a previous year. But that's not my point. My point is simply this. It was quiet in the offseason. The NFL, it was very quiet because the NFC won every Super Bowl in the NFC in the 80s, except for, two? The Raiders won in 80, and I think the Raiders won again in 83. But every other AFC team lost. Cincinnati didn't win. Miami didn't win. Buffalo didn't win. The Patriots didn't win. And the poor Broncos. The Broncos took the beatdowns for everybody in the 80s, but they got revenge in the 90s. In the NBA, it was either Philly, Boston, or the Lakers. And then the Pistons came along towards the end, and then it became Michael's reign in the 90s, and you know the rest. Also with the NFL, 2000s hit, Baltimore was hot, but then the Patriots started their run. But you never, ever, 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 ever heard stupid stories, smart stories, just football stories, basketball stories throughout the decade. Now, baseball was different because baseball in the 80s The Cardinals were perennial. The Yankees got one. The Mets, of course, got one, but the Mets were a big story for a bunch of years. But there wasn't any true dynastic teams, although the Cardinals probably would get the team of the decade because they were in more than one World Series and got robbed in one. Should have won the one against the Royals when an umpire called the guy safe and he was completely out. That would have ended the game. But again, it was a decade that had different champions. We didn't hear no stories about Cal Ripken after they won the series. Definitely didn't hear any stories about Phillies in '80. I mean, the Dodgers finally got the Yankees, and then the Yankees spiraled out of control and didn't win anything. The Cardinals shocked. I mean, like, I can tell you these things, but my point is, you ain't hearing nothing about Ozzie Smith. And then, of course, Oakland, with his Bash brothers, they got only one. And then, obviously, later on, they started to talk about steroids. And the 80s in baseball, to talk about drugs. It was cocaine was the big drug in baseball. And that, unfortunately, is keeping Keith Hernandez out of the Hall of Fame, some BS story about drugs, which we won't go into. But my point is, I'm so tired of the NBA talk and NFL talk off season today. James Harden is not worth all the attention that he gets because he don't want to play for Philadelphia. Last year, it was Kyrie and Ben Simmons. We don't need to hear all these stories. Previous year, Antonio Brown in football. The sports itself are bigger than them. I mean, at least Antonio Brown went off in the sunset in terms of he won a Super Bowl championship after being released a few times during the season, and Tom Brady was like, I can control him. And Tom Brady controlled him to finish that season to get that ring. And then Antonio went back to being Antonio and out of the league way too soon. Possibly has hurt his Hall of Fame chances. Now, is it because there's more outlets today that we hear so much about basketball? Is it the proliferation of stories about African Americans today that we hear so much more about athletes after the season's over? But they still today, I've yet to see a Denver Nugget commercial. I understand Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic are not American citizens. But I haven't seen them in a commercial yet. I haven't heard any conversation about Denver. I heard something to the effect that somebody attributed something to the Denver Nuggets saying that the Lakers are old and LeBron wants to prove to the Nuggets that the Lakers aren't old. And Coach Malone said he didn't say anything about him being old. And they welcomed the challenge. Like, nobody's scared of the Lakers. But it's like this constant. I literally yesterday, I'm watching one of my favorite shows, as I said yesterday, and one of the headlines was the Lakers. It's playoff season in baseball right now. Yes, the 4 games were, trash. Everyone's already been eliminated, so we now moved on to the second round earlier than baseball probably wanted. Because now they lose the day. Because now Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday is football. Next week, hockey starts while the playoffs are going. And the NBA is already playing preseason games as Minnesota's playing Dallas. I guess there used to be a respect thing that teams tried not to overlap or impede or intrude or make their seasons more relevant than the season that is going on. But because of the nature of the fact that all the talk shows don't want to talk about baseball, and want to only talk about redundant stories in basketball and football, not fun. And that's why I prefer the 80s and 90s sports to today. There could have been hundreds of stories about Bo Jackson. It wasn't. Hundreds of stories about Herschel Walker, the football player. Wasn't. Yes, Lawrence Taylor had issues off the field, and yes, they were chronicled. But nobody would mess with Lawrence Taylor, so the stories were kind of kept under wraps because they were afraid that he might actually come after them. But the Giants were the champions. The Giants were a story. But Washington's football team, they won championships too. They were never a story. Never heard any stories about Riggins. I mean, you heard a sad story about Dexter Manley. But that happened during the season. It wasn't off season. There was an anticipation. I keep wanting reiterating that. There was such an anticipation for the seasons. That's why we loved preseason football. Because we were like, oh my goodness, who is this guy? Who is that guy? We don't get that today. Because the draft is so elaborate and football talk doesn't. The Super Bowl ends and starts in February. It ends in February. And then they're already talking about the draft the next day, February 10th. And then the draft is in April, but it's like there's no break. There's no anticipation. I'm not anticipating this basketball season. I mean, people will say you're crazy because there's Chris Paul's on the Warriors, or Phoenix made a whole bunch of moves to make that run. The new trade that recently happened between Portland, with Lillard going to Milwaukee, and then the Celtics getting Porzingis, and then the Celtics getting Drew Holiday. So yeah, that's anticipation. But guess what? That ain't my team. My team's the Knicks. The Knicks ain't done nothing noisy. They've been quiet. But it shouldn't be that way. The story should be Denver. Denver won the championship. Not the Lakers. Not Miami. Not Portland. Milwaukee. Giannis he's a superstar. Giannis made a statement. Giannis said, I don't know if I want to sign a long-term deal until this team shows me it's committed to winning a championship. That would have never gotten out in the 80s. That's what was so stunning about Michael Jordan retiring the first time in the 80s. Well, in the 90s. Because it's like, people don't do that. People play until they get old and then they quit. He's like, dude, this game is not even fun anymore. I'm getting 30 in my sleep. I average 37.3. People scared of me. There ain't no challenge. I'm going to play baseball. That's why it was so shocking when that happened. Because we didn't have a clue. And as a Knicks fan, we were like, yes, Black Jesus is gone. We have a chance. And we get to the finals, and we lose in the 7th game. And then he comes back, and then we go back down. Well, we keep running into them. But the point was, and is there's no anticipation. The season gets slapped away so fast because of all the talk today. It doesn't make you hungry for it. They think they're making you hungry for it. I do surveys every day, and all these surveys, they ask me questions about, are you anticipating the basketball tournament? They're having an in-season basketball tournament. And players have to play. can't sit out unless you are really injured, because they want to promote this, because they think the regular season is boring. That's what's so funny. Basketball wants to make you feel like you're about to watch the greatest thing ever this season. And then they want to implement a playoff tournament during the season to keep you watching. Because in their own minds, they won't say it out loud, they think it's boring. How crazy is that? That was put in to make the players play because of load management, by the way, which didn't happen in the 80s and 90s. Players played, and those who didn't want to play, they got released. And no team would ever say, tonight, Michael Jordan is not playing against San Antonio Spurs because we don't want the Spurs to see how we're going to attack them if we meet them in the finals. That was once said. That they kept out a player because they didn't want the team to see how they're going to attack them in the playoffs. And I believe it was Miami Heat kept out LeBron and Dwayne Wade. And then I think the Spurs returned the favor. The Spurs said, Tim Duncan tonight, Tony Parker tonight, Ginobili, they're sitting out. And they said, why? Well, we don't want to let Miami see how, anybody see how we can play them in the playoffs. I miss the anticipation. Instead of being frustrated and angry with the NBA, I should be getting excited for it. But instead, I am punched in the face with dumb stories before the season starts. I miss dynamic teams. I miss dynastic teams. I miss the Edmonton Oilers being dynasty, the Islanders being a dynasty, because they were the story. I miss the NFC being the football dynasty because we knew every year that it was going to either be the Giants, Washington, Niners. Beat it. And if you can beat us, you're a champion. They couldn't do it. And no, I'm not omitting the 85 Bears because they only had one run. The Giants only had one championship too. But the Giants got to Super Bowl again at the end of the decade against Buffalo in the 90s. Bears got to the Super Bowl, 2016, 15 against the Colts. My point is, there's always an anticipation for a start of sports, start of a season. And today's sports, even in individual sports, golf's new season starts a couple weeks? They don't start next year. It used to be the first event of the year was the Hawaiian, something to do with Hawaiian Open or the Sony Open, or was it or the championship where only players who could play in the tournament were winners from the previous season. Now it's the Asian circuit, so now they go to play over in Japan and Korea because of their love of golf. They're smart enough to get the PGA there. And of course, now they have Hideki Matsuyama, who is a top 10 player. So now they're trying to, capitalize on his popularity and so on and so forth. And of course, Tiger Woods being part Asian, half Asian, they want to capitalize on his popularity, even though he don't play, but he'll go over there because they'll pay that fee to get his butt over there. And of course, mommy's from over there, so, he wants to go see mommy's family. But there's no anticipation. Ryder Cup happened. We lost. New season's going to start in a few weeks. Tennis. Tennis has the year-end championships. You're supposed to, if you qualified for it, great. You play, round-robin tournament, it's over. Well, it happens so late in the year, you blink your eyes, Australian Open, Australian qualifiers, Australian this, you know, tournaments to get you set for the Australian Open. Again, anticipation of the sport's gone. And I tell you something, and I'll shut up on the topic. Hockey has been pushed off the sports page in America, even though majority of the teams are in America. And in defending champions, Las Vegas, ain't heard a word about Las Vegas all off season. I blinked yesterday and they played the theme music and said, NHL starts Tuesday. I'm like, NHL starts Tuesday? When did that happen? Again, but I can anticipate because there's been no news about it. So I can get excited for it because there are going to be 3 games Tuesday night, and I can't wait. There's not been any big news in the offseason in hockey. There's not been any anything. No drama, no stupid stuff. A few coaches have stepped down, but it is not dominating the world of sports. So again, this is why I prefer the 80s and 90s sports. Anticipation of the season, big deal. Today, nothing to anticipate because you hear about it all the time.